At exactly 11:42 p.m. on April 18, 1935, a black man in a tailored overcoat stopped beneath a brass awning on West 52nd Street, the kind that reflected city lights like it wanted to be remembered, and a white doorman paid $12 a week to guard a fantasy, leaned forward and decided in a single careless sentence to remind him who New York believed belonged on which side of the door. The insult was not shouted. It didn't need to be. It landed softly, almost politely, the way dangerous things often do. A pause followed. Long enough for a taxi horn to echo down the block, long enough for a woman inside to laugh over piano music, long enough for the doorman to realize the man in front of him hadn't flinched. His name was Bumpy Johnson, and the city was about to learn the difference between refusing entry and inviting consequence. Inside the club, champagne glasses clinked. Outside, a gloved hand tightened briefly, then relaxed. Bumpy adjusted his cuff. He said nothing. Silence in that moment was not restraint, it was calculation. He stepped back into the street, the insult folded neatly away like a note saved for later, and the door closed again, confident it had won. It hadn't. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And while you're here, tell us in the comments, what time is it where you're watching from, and what city are you in? Because by the time midnight passed, Harlem already knew something downtown did not. Harlem didn't learn about the insult from a headline. It learned the way it always did, through proximity, through breath, through the quiet intimacy of people who understood that some stories were safer when they arrived without ink. Just after 6:00 a.m. on April 19th, 1935, a bartender on Lenox Avenue wiped the same glass 3 times without realizing it, listening as a porter from Grand Central lowered his voice and said almost apologetically that a doorman downtown had spoken out of turn to the wrong man. The name was not said loudly. It didn't need to be. It traveled intact anyway. By mid-morning, the story had crossed 110th Street at least twice. It passed through a barbershop where a folded Amsterdam News lay untouched on a chair. It moved through a numbers house where a woman paused her counting just long enough to look up and nod. Each retelling stripped away nothing essential. The location stayed precise, West 52nd. The tone stayed sharp. And one detail never changed. Bumpy Johnson hadn't reacted. That detail mattered more than the insult itself. In 1935, Harlem was home to nearly 200,000 black residents, packed into a few square miles, and everyone understood the arithmetic of survival. You could endure insults. You could not endure unpredictability. What unsettled people was not racism, it was uncertainty. Silence from a man known to respond decisively created a vacuum, and vacuums pull everything toward them. By noon, even men who didn't like Bumpy began to wonder what restraint meant this time. Bumpy himself spent the morning moving through ordinary spaces. A coffee cup steamed on a small table near 7th Avenue. He drank it slowly. He read half a newspaper article about unemployment numbers, nearly 20% nationwide, and folded the page with care. To anyone watching this, looked like routine. But routine, when chosen deliberately, becomes a message. He visited 3 places before noon, all within walking distance, all without raising his voice. He asked questions that sounded harmless. Who worked the door now? Who owned the building behind the club? Which delivery trucks came late? By early afternoon, the whispers had gained a second layer. People began asking not what Bumpy would do, but how far downtown consequences could travel without violence. That question was new. It introduced tension the city hadn't rehearsed. A patrolman on 125th Street paused longer than necessary at a corner. A club manager in Midtown double-checked a list of members that hadn't changed in years. No one could point to a threat. That was the problem. At 4:30 p.m., a man who swept floors in a building near the club made a phone call he had promised himself he would never make. He didn't ask for protection. He asked whether tonight would be loud. The answer came back calm. Probably not. Calm answers spread faster than panic. They make people imagine shapes they can't see. By sunset, Harlem had stopped whispering and started waiting. Waiting is heavier than anger. It forces people to confront their own assumptions. Was this city truly segmented by doors and policies, or only by habit? No one said it aloud, but the question settled into the evening air, thick and patient, following the rumor back downtown, step by measured step. Bumpy Johnson understood something the city rarely articulated. Power was not measured in gunfire first. It was measured in inches in access, in how easily a routine could be interrupted without anyone knowing who had touched it. On April 19, 1935, just after 8:15 p.m., he stood on the corner of 7th Avenue and 135th Street and watched traffic move like a system that assumed it would never be questioned. That assumption was what he planned to use. He did not summon men with weapons. He summoned men with keys. A janitor who controlled a service elevator. A driver who knew which deliveries arrived after midnight. A clerk who understood that membership lists were less permanent than people believed. Each conversation was brief. No promises were made. No threats were implied. Bumpy's tone stayed even almost courteous, the way a man sounds when he already knows the answer. He asked about schedules, about lights that stayed on after closing, about which back doors were used when the front ones were meant to impress. At 9:30 p.m., 3 blocks south of the club, a delivery truck idled longer than usual. Inside, crates of liquor shifted slightly as the engine vibrated. In 1935, alcohol was legal again, but supply chains still moved like they were guilty. One delayed truck could unsettle an entire night. One misplaced signature could send a manager into quiet panic. None of this required confrontation. It required patience. Bumpy crossed Midtown on foot. He liked walking at night. It kept his thoughts ordered. He passed theaters letting out early crowds, men in tuxedos laughing too loudly, women clutching coats against the cold. Outside the whites-only club, the doorman stood straighter than he had the night before. The insult had not been forgotten. It had been weighed. Bumpy did not approach. He observed. The man's eyes moved more than they should have. Fear reveals itself in small corrections. By 10:50 p.m. inside the club, something felt wrong. Not dramatically wrong, subtly. A waiter hesitated before pouring. The piano player repeated a phrase he rarely repeated. 2 members argued quietly over a table placement that had never been contested. The building's rhythm, practiced over years, had slipped half a beat. That half beat mattered. In New York City in 1935, private clubs depended on predictability. Roughly 70% of their revenue came from repeat patrons, men who paid for reassurance as much as for alcohol. Bumpy knew this statistic without ever hearing it stated. He knew men who feared embarrassment more than violence. An embarrassment unlike bullet spreads. At 11:20 p.m., a phone rang behind the bar. No one answered it at first. When someone did, the call was short. A supplier had a problem. A delivery would be late. This should not have mattered. It did. The manager checked his watch twice in under a minute. The doorman glanced inside instead of out. The door, once confident, had begun to listen. Bumpy remained across the street, hands in his pockets, a folded newspaper tucked under his arm. The headline spoke about economic recovery that hadn't reached most of the city. He didn't read it. He watched reflections in the glass. He waited for the building to notice itself. The night was not yet loud, but it was no longer quiet, and that shift, small, invisible, undeniable, was the sound of leverage taking hold. The club on West 52nd Street had survived scandals, police inspections, and the Depression without ever learning how fragile routine really was. On April 19, 1935, just before midnight, it learned, not through shouting, not through broken glass, through interruption. A coat check ticket went missing, not stolen, misplaced, the kind of mistake that makes a man feel suddenly exposed, standing in a room full of witnesses without his own belongings to anchor him. A member cleared his throat and asked for a manager. The manager smiled too quickly. Behind him, a waiter waited for instructions that didn't come. At 12:07 a.m., the piano stopped mid-song. Not dramatically. The player simply lifted his hands and looked around, confused, as if he'd lost his place in a story he had told 1,000 times. Silence pooled in the room. Someone laughed, then stopped. A glass clinked against the bar, harder than intended. In a space built for ease, effort had become visible. Outside, the doorman shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He had been on this job for 6 years. He knew which members liked to be greeted by name and which preferred anonymity. Tonight, he got 2 names wrong. He corrected himself immediately. Apologies layered on top of apologies begin to feel like admissions. Across the street, Bumpy Johnson stood beneath a streetlight that flickered irregularly, its timing off by seconds. He checked his watch once. He did not look at the door. He listened. Buildings like people announce their discomfort if you let them. A car backfired 3 blocks away. The doorman flinched. That flinch traveled inward. At 12:31 a.m., a man in a dark suit approached the bar and asked a question. No one in the room wanted to hear, was everything all right? The bartender nodded. He had nodded through worse, but this nod lacked conviction. It lingered unfinished. In 1935, New York police received over 300 noise complaints a night in Midtown alone. None would be filed about this club. That absence would be noticed. A server dropped a tray. The sound was sharp, final. Conversation stopped completely this time. Everyone turned. The tray lay on the floor like evidence. The server froze, then bent to pick it up, his hands shaking enough to make the glasses rattle again. A woman reached out to steady him, then withdrew her hand as if touching him might implicate her in whatever was happening. No one spoke Bumpy's name. That was the rule now. Names give shape to fear. Shape makes fear manageable. This fear stayed abstract, expanding to fill the room. The manager glanced toward the door, then away. He thought of membership renewals due next month. He thought of reputation, that most delicate currency. He thought of the insult replayed now with perfect clarity, stripped of its casual tone and revealed as a liability. At 12:54 a.m., the doorman finally looked across the street and saw Bumpy watching the reflection of the club in a storefront window. Not the door. The reflection. The doorman understood in that instant that the night was not about entry anymore. It was about presence. The club did not close early. That would have looked like surrender. Instead, it endured itself minute by minute, every small disruption compounding into awareness. By the time the last patron left at 2:10 a.m., no one could explain what had gone wrong. They only knew it would not be forgotten. Across the street, Bumpy unfolded his newspaper, refolded it, and walked away without looking back. The club remained standing, but it would never again assume the door was the most powerful thing it owned. By the morning of April 20th, 1935, the city had begun to take notes without writing anything down. New York was skilled at this collective memory without documentation, conclusions reached in private and enforced in public. At 7:30 a.m., a police sergeant in Midtown skimmed a stack of overnight reports and paused on one absence rather than a presence. No arrests, no disturbances, no calls from West 52nd Street. In a district that averaged nearly 40 service calls a night, silence was irregular. He marked nothing. He remembered everything. The club's management convened at 10:00 a.m. sharp. Coffee cooled untouched in thin porcelain cups. A folded ledger lay open on the table, its numbers suddenly fragile. One statistic mattered more than all the others. Nearly 60% of the club's members worked in finance or law professions allergic to uncertainty. Reputation once dented spread faster than rumor. A single canceled membership could be dismissed. 3 could not. Outside, the doorman arrived early. He adjusted his uniform twice in the lobby mirror. He replayed the insult again, now hearing it from the outside, stripped of tone, exposed as choice. He wondered who had heard it. He wondered who had not needed to. When a manager asked if everything was all right, he answered too quickly. Yes, of course. The word sounded rehearsed. Across town, Bumpy Johnson sat at a small table near a window, sunlight cutting across the surface in a way that made dust visible. A confiscated notebook lay nearby, its cover worn soft by handling. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. The chain of events was already moving on its own. Power, once nudged, prefers to finish what it starts. By noon, 2 members quietly requested their coats before lunch. By 2:00 p.m., a third asked whether the club planned to adjust its tone. The phrase was vague on purpose. Vagueness invites concession. The manager heard it as pressure. He also heard something else: inevitability. In 1935, New York had over 6,500 licensed private clubs. Most would never appear in a police ledger. They survived on invisibility. This club had become visible without spectacle, and visibility without control is exposure. The manager placed a call at 4:10 p.m. He did not ask for protection. He asked for guidance. That distinction mattered. Here is the question the city avoided but felt pressing against its ribs when an insult travels farther than a threat who has actually lost control. The doorman believed the door was his authority. The manager believed policy would shield him. The city believed habit was permanent. None of them had consulted the street. At 6:45 p.m., as evening settled again, the doorman saw Bumpy across the street, not waiting, not watching, simply present. No men around him, no gesture, just proximity. The doorman swallowed and looked away. The apology, when it came later that night, would be brief, almost bureaucratic. But before it did, New York had already chosen a side without announcing it. What would you have done if you were standing at that door, protected by policy, watched by history, and suddenly aware that silence could cost more than words? The apology did not arrive wrapped in drama. It arrived the way concessions usually do, quietly dressed as procedure. On the evening of April 20th, 1935, just after 9:00 p.m., the manager stepped outside the club with a folded piece of paper in his jacket pocket that he never intended to hand over. He had rehearsed 3 versions of what he would say. All of them were wrong by the time he opened his mouth. Bumpy Johnson stood where he had stood before, close enough to be unmistakable, far enough to remain uninvited. He was alone. That detail mattered. The manager began speaking, referencing policy, misunderstanding, and standards of the establishment. The words sounded thin in the open air. Bumpy listened without interrupting, his eyes fixed not on the man's face but on the slight tremor in his hand as he adjusted his cuff. When the manager finished, there was a pause, long enough for the streetlight to hum audibly. Then Bumpy nodded once, not in acceptance, in acknowledgement. The doorman did not speak. He did not need to. His posture had already changed, shoulders lower, chin pulled in. The transformation was physical before it was verbal. In 1935, men like him were rarely recorded in history, but they absorbed its consequences fully. He understood now that authority borrowed from rules collapses when confronted by consequence. Inside the club, the evening resumed with forced normalcy. Drinks were poured, music returned, but something had shifted permanently. In the weeks that followed, membership renewals dipped by nearly 8%, small enough to explain away, large enough to feel. One investor quietly moved his regular meetings elsewhere. Another requested a private entrance. These were not punishments, they were adjustments. Adjustments accumulate. Bumpy walked away without shaking hands. He did not look back. That mattered too. Victory that seeks recognition is incomplete. This one required only memory. Harlem heard about the apology the same way it had heard about the insult, indirectly, accurately, without embellishment. The story tightened as it traveled. Not because people exaggerated, but because they understood what to remove. Here's the second question. The city never asked out loud if no violence occurred. No laws were broken and no doors were forced. Why did everyone behave as if something irreversible had happened? The answer lingered in gestures, the way men spoke more carefully, the way policy softened without amendment, the way certain doors began to open faster, not slower. Bumpy's transformation was subtle but complete. Before he had been a man who responded. After he became a man anticipated. That shift changed how people planned their evenings, their insults, their confidence. The city adjusted its posture around him unconsciously, like a body protecting an old injury. Late that night, Bumpy stopped at a small cafe. A coffee cup sat untouched as he stared through the window at nothing in particular. He stayed only a minute, enough to let the night settle. Enough to let the city finish learning. Years later, New York still behaved as if it remembered that doorway, even when it claimed it did not. The club on West 52nd Street remained open through the late 1930s, its brass awning polished, its membership carefully curated, but something fundamental had shifted. Doors were no longer just barriers, they were signals. And signals, once misused, invite correction. By 1937, the city issued over 1.2 million summonses a year, most for minor infractions no one remembered afterward. This incident never appeared in those numbers. That absence gave it durability. It lived instead in adjustments, in the way certain doormen learned to pause before speaking, in the way managers asked quieter questions before enforcing loud rules. Policy remained unchanged. behavior did not. Bumpy Johnson never publicly referenced the night. He didn't need to. In Harlem, the story settled into its final form, not a tale of confrontation, but of calibration. The insult became secondary. What mattered was the response that never arrived as expected. Violence would have been understood. Silence that rearranged power took longer to process. That delay was the lesson. A folded newspaper from April 1935 still exists in an archive. Its headline about market recovery fading at the edges. No mention of the club, no mention of Bumpy. History often preserves the wrong artifacts. What mattered was not written down the memory of a doorman's hesitation, the way a manager's voice dropped half a register, the way a city learned to hear consequences before they arrived. Bumpy's psychological transformation was complete by then. Before he had needed to demonstrate control, after control was assumed. Men adjusted their language around him. Institutions adjusted their expectations. This was not dominance. It was recognition. Recognition is quieter, harder to reverse, and far more enduring. On a winter evening years later, a different doorman on a different street opened a door without being asked. He could not have explained why he did it. He would have said it felt correct. That is how power stories end, not with names, but with habits. The city never apologized publicly. It never corrected the record. It simply moved forward, slightly altered, carrying the lesson like a scar beneath clothing. Some doors once misused remember longer than the men who stand in them. Bumpy Johnson understood this. He had always understood it. That was why the night worked, not because it shocked New York, but because it taught the city something about itself that it could not unlearn. The doorway on West 52nd Street still existed for years after. People walked through it unaware they were passing a quiet boundary drawn in 1935, when an insult met patience and patience rearranged a city. What lingered after that spring of 1935 was not the insult itself, nor even the apology that followed, but the way New York learned to carry memory without ceremony. Cities are often described as forgetful, yet this one remembered in posture and timing, in the half-second pause before a sentence is spoken. History did not mark the night with headlines or trials. It marked it with restraint. Bumpy Johnson did not change the law. He did not demand entry. He did not ask the city to see him differently. He allowed it to reveal itself, then live with what it saw. That is a rarer form of power, one that operates without witnesses and survives without proof. It leaves no monument, only habits. And habits once formed are stubborn things. The doorman went on with his life. The club continued its dinners and music. New York kept moving, always convinced the next day erased the last. Yet somewhere beneath the noise, a quiet recalibration endured. Doors learned to hesitate. Words learned to soften. Men learned that certainty could be more dangerous than fear. History often teaches us through catastrophe. This time it taught through silence. Through a man who chose not to respond the way everyone expected, and in doing so exposed the fragility of rules built on assumption rather than respect. The lesson was not about race alone, nor crime, nor power. It was about inevitability, how once a moment is handled with precision, everything afterward adjusts to accommodate it. Memory is fragile, humanity more so. What survives are the small decisions made under pressure, the pauses that redirect entire systems, the nights that never announce their importance. New York carried that lesson forward imperfectly, quietly, never admitting it had learned anything at all. And somewhere in that silence, the legend remained not as myth, but as warning, patience, and proof.